Brooke's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. Now that Margaret's gone, you'll sign the company over to Mitchell and stop being a burden. The words hit harder than the Georgia summer heat that still clung to my black suit. Just hours earlier, I'd stood beneath pecan trees at my wife's grave. Now, in the Dallas headquarters of Callahan Construction, my own daughter-in-law leaned across the polished table, lips painted red, eyes cold, demanding I erase myself. My son Mitchell sat beside her, shoulders slumped, too weak to protest. My grandson Ryan, 22 and glued to his phone, smirked as if waiting for the spoils of war to be handed over. Brooke shoved a folder toward me. The papers hissed across the wood until they stopped at my fingertips. Sign them, Henry. Today. The board's ready to move on without you. I didn't flinch. I just smiled. They thought my grief had left me hollow. What they didn't know was that Margaret hadn't left me empty. She'd left me armed. Her last secret wasn't written in her will. It was locked in a cedar box beneath her study floorboards. And the lawyer about to walk through that door carried proof that would bane their illusions to ash. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The silence thickened, heavier than Dallas humidity in August. Jessica thought she'd cornered me. Mitchell thought I'd roll over. Ryan thought he'd inherit without lifting a finger. But I was thinking only of Margaret's letter, the DNA test, and the storm I was about to unleash. If you want my signature, I said, my hand resting on the folder, then you'll want to stay and listen. The look on Brooke's face told me the war had just begun. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. Grief is a strange companion. It doesn't knock, it just barges in, rearranges the furniture of your mind, and dares you to live around it. For me, it showed up in the smallest ways. The hum of the air conditioner at night, louder than it had ever seemed. The smell of Margaret's lavender hand cream still lingering on the edge of our bathroom sink. The empty space on the right side of our bed, a space that mocked me every time I rolled over, expecting to feel her warmth. I thought I was prepared. 40 years of marriage doesn't end without warnings. The doctors had been honest about the cancer. But honesty doesn't soften the silence. And silence had become my new reality. I kept busy with little things. A trip to Tom Thumb for groceries, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry bees overhead. Standing too long in front of the cereal aisle because Margaret was the one who always picked the brand. Sitting at the Whataburger drive-thru, my old truck idling, ordering a #1 with cheese out of habit before remembering I only needed one meal now. That's when the truth hit me hardest. Not at the funeral, not even in that boardroom with Brooke breathing down my neck. It was in those moments of habit, the everyday routines of a life built for two. Losing her felt like losing half of myself. And here's the thing. I had always believed that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries. It was Margaret who pushed me to stand tall, who narrowed her eyes across a boardroom table when she knew I was giving too much ground. Without her, I told myself it would be easier just to let people have their way. Retreat, avoid conflict, fade into the background. That was my misbelief. That surrender was survival. But Margaret knew better. Even in her final days, she tried to remind me that a legacy isn't just brick and steel. It's the courage to defend what matters. She left me more than memories. She left me a shield I didn't even know existed until I found that cedar box. At night, I'd sit in her study, the air heavy with the scent of old books and faint lavender. I would run my fingers across the worn edges of her poetry collection, tracing the lines she loved. I felt her everywhere in that room, as though the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice what she had hidden. Looking back, I think Margaret understood me better than I understood myself. She knew I'd be tempted to cave when Brooke started circling, knew I'd want to keep the peace, to do the right thing even when it meant erasing myself. That's why she left the letter. That's why she left me the truth. I can see now that what I thought was survival was actually slow surrender. And Margaret wasn't about to let me hand over the company we built to people who saw her death as a payday. But the truth didn't start in that boardroom. It started days earlier, in the quiet of her study, when a misplaced floorboard turned my grief into fire. The night after Margaret's funeral, the house felt like a stranger's. Neighbors had brought casseroles, pies, even barbecue from Hutchins down in Plano. The fridge was full, but I couldn't eat. I walked through the rooms aimlessly, every corner carrying her touch. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish. The hallway mirror still had one of her sticky notes tucked in the corner, her handwriting reminding me to pick up dry cleaning I never did. But her study I had avoided. That was her sanctuary. It smelled of lavender and old paper, and the thought of stepping inside felt like trespassing. That night, though, something pulled me in. I opened the door, and the air hit me like a wave. The curtains were still drawn, and dust danced in the beam of a single lamp I hadn't turned on since she passed. Her armchair, faded burgundy, sagged in the middle where she used to curl up with a book. On the desk sat her reading glasses, folded neatly on top of a stack of old architecture journals. Margaret loved reading about the history of buildings because they outlive us, she used to say. I ran my hand along the spines of her books, my fingertips dragging across titles she had read a dozen times. The grief pressed down harder than ever. My knee bumped the side of her desk, sending one heavy book thudding to the floor. When I bent to pick it up, I noticed it. A floorboard. Just slightly out of place. I'd walked over it 1,000 times. But now, in the stillness, it was obvious. My heart pounded as I crouched, pushing my fingers into the seam. With a groan, the wood lifted free, revealing a dark hollow underneath. Inside lay a cedar box, plain but heavy, like it carried the weight of years. I lifted it out carefully. The scent of cedar and thyme drifted upward, and for a moment I just sat there, holding it in my lap, afraid of what it might mean. Finally, I unlatched the simple clasp. Inside were 3 things. First, a lock of baby hair, dark and silky, tied with a pale blue ribbon. Second, a hospital birth certificate, yellowed with age. My name, Henry Callahan, was typed on the line for father. Margaret Callahan on the line for mother. And on the line for child's name, Henry Callahan Jr. But Mitchell's birth certificate had never read Jr. The third item was a sealed envelope, thick, cream-colored, with my name on the front in Margaret's elegant script. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. My dearest Henry, my love, my only love. The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I wiped them away and kept reading. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I have left you with one last, terrible truth. I have carried it for 48 years, afraid it would break us if I spoke it aloud. Please forgive me. Please try to understand. I gripped the pages tighter. The boy we raised, Mitchell, is not the son I gave birth to. Our son, our Henry Jr., was born with lungs too weak to survive. He lived 6 hours. You were in the hallway calling our families when the doctors told me. I thought my heart had shattered beyond repair. Then, I heard another baby crying in the room next door. The nurse, Clara, told me the child's mother was a young girl, alone, planning to give him up. In that moment of grief and desperation, she offered me something unthinkable, a switch, to go home with a healthy baby, to spare you the agony of knowing we had lost ours. I said yes. Forgive me, Henry. I loved Mitchell with my whole soul, but the truth is, he was not born of us. I believed I was protecting you. I believed we could bury the pain. I was wrong. I let the letter fall into my lap. My chest tightened until I thought I might break. My son, no, not my son, wasn't my blood. My wife had carried that secret for nearly 50 years, alone. But the letter didn't end there. Henry, I see what Brooke has done to him. She has twisted Mitchell into believing entitlement is love, and greed is respect. They will come for the company. They will see you not as a father, but as an obstacle. My love, I cannot stop them from where I am going, but I can arm you with the truth. Use it. Protect what we built. Protect what is yours. The words burned in my hands. Margaret hadn't left me a burden. She had left me a weapon. I sat on the floor of that study for what felt like hours. Grief layered itself in new, jagged forms. Grief for the baby I never knew. Grief for the woman who carried a secret to protect me. Grief for the life we might have had. But underneath, something sharper formed. Resolve. I could not do this alone. There was only one person I could trust. I pulled my phone from my pocket, hands still shaking, and dialed David Chen, my lawyer, but more importantly, my friend of 30 years. Henry, he said on the second ring, his voice warm, concerned. I was just thinking of calling. How are you holding up? David, I whispered. I found something. Something Margaret left. A letter. The warmth in his tone vanished, replaced by sharp, professional focus. Tell me. I told him. Not every word. I couldn't. But I told him enough. That Mitchell wasn't mine. That Margaret had carried the truth to her grave. The silence on the line was heavy. I imagined David standing in his office overlooking downtown Dallas, staring out at the lights. Finally, he spoke. My God, Henry. She must have carried that alone all these years. Yes, I said, my voice raw. And she wants me to carry it now. To use it. David's reply was firm, almost fierce. Then we will. The letter is not the weapon, it's the map. The weapon is science. We'll get a DNA test, legally admissible. And we'll find your son. Margaret wanted you to fight. And you will. That was the moment my misbelief cracked wide open. I wasn't meant to surrender. I was meant to fight. For Margaret. For the legacy we built. For the truth. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. David came to my kitchen the next morning with a stack of legal pads and the kind of steady calm I'd come to trust. He poured coffee for both of us from an insulated thermos and sat across from me at the battered oak table where Margaret and I had balanced budgets and argued about color swatches for 30 years. We're not going to start with accusations, he said. We start with documents, timelines, and a court-ordered chain of custody. He tapped a pencil against the pad like he was marking the beat of a metronome. First step, legally admissible DNA. Second step, locate the biological A. Third step, lock down the company's voting rights so Brooke can't move assets while we litigate. He used words that sounded like armor, chain of custody, subpoena, genetic haplotype analysis, and I felt less like a man being ambushed by grief and more like a general studying a map. Can you get tissue samples from the hospital after nearly 50 years? I asked, swallowing air thick with coffee and dread. Yes, David said. Hospitals keep pathology samples and archive tissue for years. We'll file a motion for a court order, civil discovery. The filing fee for a motion in Dallas County Civil Court runs about $350, plus service fees. Labs that run legally admissible paternity tests charge a few $100s more. Though for court-admissible chain of custody tests, you're often looking at closer to $800 to $1,200. It's not cheap, but it's clean. He sketched the timeline, file discovery and a preservation of evidence order, then subpoena the hospital archives and the sample chain. While the court clerk processed the paperwork, civil filings in Dallas moved on a strict schedule, would hire a private investigator to find the man Margaret mentioned. David had already lined up someone who specialized in cold case family reunions, a discreet former investigator out of Plano with a knack for dusty paper trails and stubborn people. We need to be surgical, David said. No leaks. No grandstanding. If Brooke or Mitchell catch wind that we're searching for DNA, they'll yank the company books. They'll move trusts. They'll gaslight anyone who asks questions. So first we freeze any changes at the Registrar of Corporations and file a notice with the board that material transfers are under legal review. He explained a practical legal lever I hadn't thought about, temporary injunctive relief. If we could show a credible threat that assets might be moved or altered to defeat the will's intent, a judge could bar any transfer until the matter was resolved. To get that, we needed evidence of motive and a plausible likelihood of success. Enter Vivian's letter and the DNA plan. And the company. I asked, what about payroll, loans, the affordable housing project on the south side? We maintain operations, David answered. You remain CEO in every public filing. We file an emergency motion only to prevent the transfer of controlling shares. The bank that holds our construction loan, Fifth Line Bank, will be notified that any change in controlling interest is subject to legal dispute. Real estate and lien notices will reflect the same. That's how we buy time. He also mentioned contingency. A modest monthly stipend for Mitchell. Vivian had asked for that in her letter, and a counseling condition written into the settlement to protect Marcus's dignity while shielding the company. We're not monsters, David reminded me. We're protecting a legacy and a livelihood. We built a legal checklist right there on the kitchen table. Preservation order. Subpoena to St. Mary's Hospital Pathology Archives. Court-ordered chain of custody DNA tests. Private investigator engagement. Injunctive relief petition. Notice to lenders. And an immediate corporate resolution freezing share transfers. Each item had a deadline. The nearest was a shareholder meeting scheduled in 10 days where, if left unchecked, Brooke intended to move a vote. That gave us a timer. 10 days to get the injunction and evidence or risk the company being tied up in business-as-usual maneuvers. How long will an injunction take? I asked, my voice small. Depends on the judge, David said. But with a credible showing and the will, we can get an emergency hearing within a week in many Dallas courts. That's why the PI and the lab need to move fast. We'll also ask the court to expedite the hospital's records production. The plan was surgical and strictly by the book. No public shaming, no leaks, no threats, just paperwork, science, and precise timing. I liked the simplicity of it. Margaret's secret was not a bludgeon. It was a legal lever that, used correctly, would force a re-evaluation of entitlement and bloodline exactly where it mattered, on paper, in court, and in the eyes of other stakeholders. We also prepared for pushback. Brooke could launch a PR campaign to paint me as a spiteful widower. She could hire counsel to contest the will's language and argue undue influence. David had a response for that too. Contemporaneous witnesses, the signed notarized directive Margaret had executed, and a lab-back paternity test. Not emotion, but evidence. Is this moral? I asked at one point, my lip trembling around the question. To go after my son like this? David's eyes softened. You're not going after your son. You're honoring the wishes of your wife. You're also ensuring the company doesn't get hollowed out by people who see your grief as a dividend. There's nothing immoral about protecting what you built together. He closed the file with a decisive snap and stood up. We'll begin filings today. I'll draft the preservation order. I'll call the PI. You call Elijah, if you want him on board. But one more thing. Do not tell anyone else. Not Brooke. Not Mitchell. Not Ryan. This is going to work because they won't see it coming. As David left, his briefcase at his side and his shoes whispering on the hardwood, I felt a knot loosen in my chest. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, the grief settled into a purpose. I had a plan, a team, and a timetable. The company, our people, and the affordable housing project depended on me not flinching. Then the pushback started. The first pushback came faster than I expected. 3 days after David filed the preservation order, I received an email from the county clerk's office. The subject line was sterile, but the words inside were anything but. Opposing counsel has filed an emergency motion to dismiss injunctive relief, citing lack of standing. Brooke had lawyered up. I wasn't surprised. She was the kind of person who knew which boutique law firm downtown charged the highest hourly rate, and wore it like a badge of honor. Still, the speed of it rattled me. It meant she'd sensed something brewing, even if she didn't know exactly what. David called me within minutes. His voice was calm, but I could hear the irritation under the surface. They're trying to stall us out. Classic move. They'll argue you're too old to manage the company, and that you're dragging your feet to preserve control. Don't worry, we've got a stronger filing. But Henry, this means they're watching. Watching meant danger. Not physical, but reputational. Brooke thrived on gossip, and Dallas has a way of turning whispers into headlines overnight. The second complication came from inside the company itself. I drove down I-30 one morning, the skyline sharp against a hot, blue Texas sky. Our main project site sat near Oak Cliff, an affordable housing complex Margaret had championed. She'd insisted we dedicate part of our profits to it, even when the board grumbled. When I stepped onto the site, I felt the heat radiate off the red clay, the smell of cut lumber sharp in the air. Men in hard hats paused to nod respectfully. But the project manager, a wiry man named Frank with 30 years under his belt, pulled me aside. Mr. Callahan, he said, lowering his voice, we got word from upstairs this morning. Materials for the affordable housing wing are being reallocated to the luxury side. I froze. By whose order? He rubbed the back of his neck. Came down from Marcus's office. But we all know who's behind it. Brooke. It was a tactical move. Starve the affordable housing side, delay progress, make it look like my pet projects were bleeding money. It wasn't just an attack on me. It was a shot at Margaret's dream. Leave it for now, I told Frank, though my jaw tightened. Do not touch those materials until you hear from me directly. Understood? He nodded. Understood, say. The third complication came in the form of money. Always money. David called me that evening. Henry, we've got a problem. Brooke's attorneys filed for an expedited shareholder vote on a new line of credit. They want to push through a $20 million financing package for a downtown tower project. Without board approval. I asked. With a bare majority, David said grimly. If they get it, they'll leverage the company into debt so deep that even if you win the inheritance fight, you'll inherit a sinking ship. They want you to drown in obligations. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the empty spot where Margaret used to sit during our late-night talks. Her eyes would have narrowed, that way they did when she wanted me to trust my instincts. What's our counter? I asked. David didn't hesitate. We show the court that material assets are at risk of dissipation. We tie their financing maneuver into our injunction. But to make it stick, we'll need more than Vivian's letter. We'll need evidence, emails, board minutes, anything that shows deliberate sabotage of your projects. That night, I dug through my desk drawers and came across something small but powerful. An email printout from 6 months earlier, when Brooke had tried to cut the affordable housing project entirely. She'd written, "There's no profit in sentimentality. The board must stop indulging Henry's nostalgia." Her words were sharp enough to draw blood. At the time, I tucked the email away, hurt but unwilling to pick a fight. Now, it was ammunition. Mini reveal number 1. That single sheet of paper reframed everything. This wasn't about Brooke securing Mitchell's future. It wasn't about Ryan stepping up. It had never been about family legacy. It was about money. Always money. My grief was just an opening she could exploit. David agreed when I faxed it over. "This goes straight to motive," he said. "She's not acting in good faith. She's eroding shareholder value by undermining company projects that carry long-term returns. We'll show the court this is about her self-interest, not the company's survival." The pressure mounted from all sides, legal, financial, reputational. I felt it in my body. The sleepless nights where the ceiling fan spun endlessly, the knots in my stomach that no amount of coffee could ease, the way my hands trembled when I tried to read the paper. But beneath all that, something shifted. Brooke thought she was fighting for money. Mitchell thought he was fighting for approval. Ryan thought he was fighting for convenience. But I was fighting for Margaret. And that's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. This wasn't a battle to preserve my role as CEO. It was a battle to honor my wife's legacy, and to put the company into hands that would protect it long after I was gone. I'd spent weeks telling myself I was fighting to stay in control, to keep my name on the door, to hold the title of CEO until the day I couldn't walk into that office anymore. But Margaret's voice in that letter kept echoing in my head. Protect what is ours. Protect what is yours. It wasn't about control. It was about legacy. And legacy didn't live in title. It lived in the wake itself, in the way we built homes people could actually afford, in the way we trained apprentices to become master builders, in the way Margaret believed buildings should stand as long as memories did. That shift hit me like a hammer in the chest. It came to a head at a board meeting the following week. The air in the conference room was heavy with tension, the kind you could feel in your bones. Brooke sat at the far end of the table, all sharp edges in her tailored black suit. Mitchell was beside her, hands folded like a schoolboy waiting to be told what to think. Ryan slouched in his chair, earbuds dangling from his pocket like a silent rebellion. They'd pushed through a motion to divert funds from the Oak Cliff Affordable Housing Project. The vote wasn't final, but they had enough influence to swing it unless I spoke up. For years, I kept the peace at these meetings. Smoothed things over. Avoided confrontation to keep the company's name clean and my family's dinner civil. But this time, when Brooke cleared her throat to push the motion forward, I leaned into the table and said 2 words I hadn't said in years. No more. The room went silent. Brooke blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." I straightened, my palms flat on the polished mahogany. I said no more. Margaret and I built this company to do more than stack steel and glass downtown. We built it to leave something behind for this community. Affordable housing stays. You want to cut it, you do it over my dead body. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to his wife. Ryan smirked like I'd just made good theater. But Brooke's face told me everything. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, she didn't look smug. She looked rattled. "You're letting grief cloud your judgment," she said smoothly, recovering her composure. "This is business. Emotions don't build skyscrapers." "Neither does greed," I shot back. You're bleeding the company dry to fund vanity projects and pad your lifestyle. Not one of you has lifted a hammer on a job site, yet you think you've earned the right to dictate what gets built. Not anymore. The words hung there like nails driven into wood. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about drawing a line in ink and stone. A declaration. I would not surrender quietly. Something unexpected happened in the silence that followed. Elijah, quiet, steady Elijah, who'd been sitting 2 seats down as a project manager invited to give updates, spoke up. Mr. Callahan's right, he said, his voice calm but firm. Affordable housing isn't just sentiment. It's sound business. It stabilizes communities, lowers crime rates, increases property values over time. We've got the data to prove it. Cutting it isn't just heartless. It's short-sighted. Brooke snapped her gaze toward him, sharp as glass. This isn't your concern. But Elijah didn't flinch. He held his stare with quiet confidence. For the first time, I saw it through a different lens. This wasn't just about whether I could outmaneuver Brooke. It was about who would lead when I was gone. And in Elijah's steady presence, his clear defense of the values Margaret and I built our company on, I saw the future. That was the moment my goals shifted. No longer was I just trying to cling to my role or prove Brooke wrong. I was fighting to protect the company long enough to pass it into the right hands, the hands of a man who cared about the work, the people, and the principles. I sat back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. Then I said it, plain as steel. So I stopped asking for permission, I told the room, and I started following the rules, every single one. Brooke's eyes narrowed. She didn't know what rules I meant. She didn't know the trap had already been set. The next 10 days became a blur of paperwork, courthouse filings, and quiet maneuvers. It felt less like grief and more like construction work, laying rebar, pouring foundations, checking every measurement twice. Only this time, instead of steel and concrete, it was affidavits, certified mail, and chain of custody logs. David handled the heavy lifting. I just followed instructions like a foreman, making sure the crew didn't miss a bolt. Step 1, the DNA test. David filed a motion with the Dallas County Civil Court for preservation and discovery of archived tissue samples from St. Mary's Hospital. Mitchell had undergone a tonsillectomy when he was 8 years old, and pathology labs in Texas were required to store paraffin tissue blocks for decades. It wasn't glamorous work, but those paraffin blocks were about to become dynamite. The filing fee was $371.75. David joked that it was the cheapest ammunition he'd ever bought. Within 48 hours, the court issued a preservation order to the hospital's pathology archives. A chain of custody courier collected the samples in sealed containers, each one tagged and signed. A nurse I'd never met signed her initials on the transfer log. Every step left a paper trail thicker than a phone book. At the same time, I swabbed my own cheek in David's office. The lab tech sealed the cotton swab in a tamper-proof envelope, logged the date and time, 10:43 a.m. on a Thursday, and handed me a carbon copy of the chain of custody form. It felt oddly satisfying, like signing off on a shipment of steel beams. Except this shipment would decide everything. Step 2, injunction. David drafted an emergency motion for temporary injunctive relief, citing risk of asset dissipation. He attached Brooke's email about nostalgia, Margaret's notarized will, and a sworn statement from me about the attempted transfer of shares. We also included Frank's site report that materials were being redirected away from the Oak Cliff housing project. The court set a hearing for the following Monday. That was fast by Dallas standards. David said the judge must have sensed there was fire behind the smoke. Brooke's attorney showed up in designer suits, arguing I was stalling progress. But when David slid Brooke's email across the table, her words about nostalgia dripping with contempt for the company's mission, the judge's eyebrows arched. Injunction granted, the judge said, gavel striking like a nail gun. That one sentence froze Brooke's plans in place. No share transfers, no new loans, no siphoning materials until the inheritance matter was settled. Step 3, the search. The private investigator David hired, a retired Plano detective named Sandra Delgado, moved like a bloodhound through dusty records. Margaret had left breadcrumbs in her letter. The date, the hospital, even the name of the nurse, Clara. Sandra tracked adoption records, cross-referenced county filings, and spent hours in basements where old paper files hadn't yet been digitized. 3 days later, she called David with a lead. I think I've got him, she said. David put her on speakerphone in my kitchen. Her voice was matter-of-fact, clipped from years of writing reports. Male child, born the same day Margaret delivered. Adopted out within 2 weeks to a couple in Arlington. The adoptive parents passed 5 years ago. The son, he's alive, living right here in Dallas. My breath caught. What's his name? I asked, my voice shaking. Elijah Hayes, she said. For a moment, the world tilted. The same Elijah who had been working on our sites for years, who I'd mentored without even realizing why I felt so drawn to him. Margaret's secret hadn't just been about truth. It had been about destiny. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen. Margaret had known I'd find this. She'd left me the pieces, and fate had done the rest. Step 4. Fortify the company. David filed notices with Fifth Line Bank, our primary lender, informing them that all controlling share transfers were frozen under court order. We also sent certified letters to the Texas Secretary of State and the Dallas County Clerk's office. Every move Brooke tried to make would hit a wall of stamped, notarized paper. I also called a meeting with our project foreman, Frank from Oak Cliff, Mike from the Tower downtown, and 2 others. We met at a diner off I-35, the kind with vinyl booths and endless coffee refills. I told them straight, you'll hear rumors. You'll hear Brooke's version. Don't believe any of it. We're steady. Payroll's secure. Keep building. Frank nodded. As long as the check's clear, Mr. Callahan, we'll build until the sun burns out. That was loyalty. Not the kind you buy, but the kind you earn by standing beside men in mud and heat for decades. By the end of that week, we had the DNA samples under lab analysis, the injunction in place, the PI confirming Elijah's identity, and the bank notified. Every piece was locked in, every chain of custody form signed in ink. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I had cornered them, papered them in, and left them no escape. I was wrong. For a brief moment, it felt like I'd won. The injunction froze Brooke's schemes. The DNA lab confirmed receipt of the samples. The PI's report put Elijah's name right in my hands. Margaret's shield was working exactly as she intended. I walked into Callahan Construction the next Monday with my head high, the hum of the elevators echoing like a drumbeat of victory. But victories can be paper-thin. That afternoon, the first crack showed. A local business reporter from the Dallas Morning News called my office. Mr. Callahan, she said, we're hearing whispers that you're contesting your own son's inheritance. Do you have a statement? I froze. The case was sealed. Only a handful of people knew. Which meant one thing. Brooke had leaked it. No comment, I said, and hung up. But the damage was already rolling downhill. By evening, the story was online. Callahan Patriarch challenges heir, board in turmoil. The comments were brutal. Some called me a senile old man clinging to power. Others called Mitchell a victim of greed. It was gossip dressed up as news, and Brooke was behind every word. The next morning, things got worse. The Oak Cliff site foreman, Frank, called me at 7 a.m. Mr. Callahan, I've got bad news. The steel shipment we were supposed to get this week, canceled. Supplier says the purchase order was rescinded by corporate. I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white. By who? Came from Marcus's office, Frank said, his voice low. But we know who's pulling those strings. Brooke again. She couldn't move the shares or the money, but she could strangle the projects in the field. She was trying to make me look incompetent in front of the board, to turn Margaret's dream into a liability. I drove out to Oak Cliff that morning. The sun was already beating down, sweat pooling under my collar as I walked the muddy site. Workers stood around waiting, their tools idle, the air thick with frustration. We'll get it sorted, I told them. But the words felt hollow without steel to back them up. The final blow came 2 days later. At the lab, David met me in his office, his jaw tight. He pushed a sheet of paper across the desk. Preliminary results are delayed, he said. There's a discrepancy in the chain of custody log. The hospital archivist claims one of the paraffin blocks is missing. I stared at him. Missing. It was signed out by a technician 2 weeks ago, David said grimly. Before the court order. No record of where it went. My stomach dropped. Without that tissue sample, the DNA comparison might not hold up in court. And if it didn't, Brooke would tear us apart in cross-examination. Henry, David said carefully. It's possible Brooke's attorneys got wind of the order and leaned on someone at the hospital. Nothing illegal on the surface, just convenient timing. The room tilted around me. For the first time, I felt the weight of Margaret's secret pressing like a vice. I'd believed the letter and the plan were unshakable, but now the ground was shifting under my boots. I went home that night and sat in Margaret's study. The cedar box still rested on her desk, the lock of baby hair inside glowing faintly in the lamplight. I touched it gently, as though it might answer back. "They are winning," I whispered into the empty room. "Even with your letter, even with the truth, they are still finding ways to bleed me out." The air was thick and silent, but I could almost hear Margaret's voice. "Look deeper, Henry. Don't stop here." And then I remembered. The email Brooke had written wasn't the only document I had tucked away. Years ago, Margaret had insisted we keep a hard copy archive of company minutes and project notes in a locked cabinet at headquarters. If there was proof of manipulation, it would be in those pages. The thought jolted me upright. I wasn't beaten yet, but I'd been fighting on the surface. The real battle, the real proof, was buried in the paper trail Margaret and I had built long before Brooke ever set foot in our lives. Until one line in an old message changed everything. The next morning, I was in the company archives before the sun cleared the Dallas skyline. The basement smelled of dust, ink, and old paper, the scent of decades of decisions. Margaret had always said the past had a way of protecting the future if you kept the receipts. I unlocked the filing cabinet she'd insisted we keep. Inside were neatly labeled binders, board minutes, project approvals, correspondence, each one marked by year, her handwriting looping across the spines. I pulled down the binder for 2015, the year Brooke had first begun whispering in Mitchell's ear about modernizing the company. I flipped through pages until my eyes caught a single line, buried in a set of board minutes. It was subtle, almost invisible in the legal language. Motion proposed by Director Marcus Callahan, seconded by Board Advisor Brooke Callahan, to authorize discretionary reallocation of project funds without prior full board approval in cases deemed non-core strategic. The motion had passed narrowly, thanks to proxy votes Brooke had gathered. There it was. The weapon. It wasn't just that she was siphoning resources away from Oak Cliff. She had quietly built herself a legal mechanism to gut any project she didn't like, all under the banner of non-core strategic. And the kicker. The notes showed Margaret had voted against it. Her dissent recorded in careful, pointed words. Legacy cannot be reduced to core profit margins. I sat back in the hard metal chair, the paper trembling in my hands. That single line reframed everything. Brooke hadn't been improvising. She'd been laying track for years, brick by brick, motion by motion. Her plan wasn't just greed. It was strategy, systematic erosion of Margaret's values, dressed up as efficiency. And then something else clicked. 2 binders down, I found the project approval notes for the Oak Cliff development. Tucked into the appendices was an email exchange between Brooke and a supplier. She had instructed them to reroute a steel order per amended discretion policy, weeks before the board ever discussed budget cuts. The date was damning. It showed she had acted without authorization, exploiting that 2015 motion like it was her personal piggy bank. I felt Margaret's presence beside me, her sharp eyes urging me to see what she had left in plain ink. I carried the binder straight to David's office. He was already at his desk, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. He scanned the documents, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't just mismanagement," he said, tapping the motion. "This is breach of fiduciary duty. She's diverting assets for personal gain under a clause she engineered. Judges love paper trails, Henry. And this is dynamite." "But what about the DNA?" I asked, still stung by the missing sample. David smiled faintly, a rare thing. "The chain of custody snag actually works in our favor now, because it shows interference. And with this paper trail, we don't even need to lean solely on biology. We've got fraud, self-dealing, and violation of shareholder trust." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "But here's the kicker. Remember how Vivian worded her will? To my direct bloodline heir, should one be identified. That means we don't need the missing tonsil block. We only need the swab from you and a fresh sample from Mitchell. The court can compel him to submit, given the contested inheritance. And if he refuses, that refusal itself will speak volumes." The gears clicked into place. Margaret hadn't just left me the truth. She'd left me the map, the receipts, and the wording sharp enough to cut through Brooke's lies. David gathered the binders into his briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut like a gavel. Now we know exactly where to stand, Henry, and exactly how to strike. For the first time, I felt the grief in my chest ease, not because the pain was gone, but because Margaret's hand was guiding me. She had left breadcrumbs, and I had finally followed them to the heart of the maze. I wasn't just an old man clinging to power. I was a husband honoring a promise, a builder defending his foundation, and a father, by blood or not, drawing a line that could not be crossed. Now I knew exactly where to stand. The boardroom was colder than usual, the air conditioning humming like an uninvited witness. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, Margaret's empty chair beside me. Across the polished surface sat Brooke, sharp as a knife in her fitted suit, Mitchell sagging in her shadow, and Ryan scrolling on his phone like none of this mattered. The heavy oak door opened. David Chen walked in, his gray suit crisp, his leather briefcase in hand. He set it on the table with a thud that silenced even Ryan's tapping thumbs. "Good afternoon," David said smoothly. "We're here to address the inheritance clause of Margaret Callahan's will." Brooke leaned forward, her smile saccharine. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, this is a family matter. Henry and I were just finalizing the transfer of shares." David didn't even glance at her. He placed a blue folder, the same shade Margaret loved, on the table and opened it with deliberate care. "Correction, Mrs. Callahan. This is a legal matter." He began to read. "I, Margaret Callahan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. All my personal assets, including shares of Callahan Construction, shall pass to my husband, Henry Callahan, and / or to my direct bloodline heir, should one be identified." The room went still. Mitchell blinked, confused. Ryan finally looked up from his phone. Brooke's lips twitched, but she recovered quickly. "Obviously, that refers to Mitchell. He's her son." David's eyes flicked toward her, calm and unyielding. "That is precisely the point that requires clarification." From his briefcase, he produced a sealed envelope from a certified genetics lab. The stark white paper sat between us like a ticking clock. He slit it open with a silver letter opener, the sound of tearing paper loud in the silence. He read, his voice steady. "Pursuant to genetic analysis comparing the DNA of Henry Callahan with that of Mitchell Callahan, the probability of paternity is 0.0%. The words landed like a wrecking ball. Mitchell's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came out. His hands shook as he grabbed the table edge. No, that's not possible. Mom, she would never." Brooke exploded. She shot out of her chair, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Lies. This is forged. You're a bitter old man twisting science to keep control." David ignored her. He slid another document across the table, Margaret's handwritten letter, the one that had shattered my world and armed me with hairs. "Your husband may want to read this," he said quietly. Mitchell's trembling hands opened it. His eyes scanned the familiar script. His shoulders buckled. The sound that left him was half sob, half gasp, the sound of a boy losing his mother all over again. Brooke's fury sputtered in the face of his collapse. She was alone now, shrieking into a void. David's voice cut through the chaos. Calm, precise, unstoppable. Per Margaret Callahan's directive, in the event Mitchell Callahan is proven not to be a biological heir, all shares transfer to the direct bloodline heir. Ladies and gentlemen, we have identified him. The door opened again. Elijah Hayes stepped inside, boots still dusty from the job site, collared shirt clean but plain. He looked bewildered, but his posture was straight, his eyes steady. David gestured toward him. "Meet Elijah Hayes, the biological son of Henry and Margaret Callahan." The silence that followed was deeper than any I'd ever known. Brooke's face twisted into something feral, her plans disintegrating before her eyes. Ryan's phone slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. Mitchell buried his face in Margaret's letter, broken in a way that even Brooke couldn't command. I stood. My legs felt stronger than they had in years. I walked around the table, past Brooke's glare, past Mitchell's collapse, until I stood in front of Elijah. Up close, I saw it, the steadiness in his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the same spark Margaret had carried all her life. I put my hands on his shoulders. My voice was quiet but filled the room. "Hello, son. I've been waiting a very long time for you." Elijah swallowed hard, eyes glistening, but he didn't look away. "Say, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to," I said. "Just stand with me." Behind us, Brooke screamed threats about lawsuits, about dragging us through the courts until the company was ashes. But her words had lost all teeth. The law was on my side. The truth was in my hands. And Margaret's legacy had just stepped into the room, flesh and blood. My pulse slowed. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt peace. The trap was sprung. The war was over. Then came the calls. The boardroom emptied slowly, like the air hissing from a punctured tire. Brooke went first, dragged out by security after her shrieking threats turned to wild flailing. The guards were gentle but firm, their footsteps echoing down the hall until the sound disappeared. Mitchell stayed slumped at the table. His fingers clutched Margaret's letter so tightly the pages were wrinkled and damp. He didn't look at me. Didn't look at anyone. David laid a hand on his shoulder, but Mitchell shrugged it off with a hollow, broken movement. He was 48 years old, but in that moment, he was a child, grieving the only mother he'd ever known, and the truth that had shattered him. Ryan was already gone. His chair sat empty, the phone he'd dropped still buzzing on the floor. By the time I bent to pick it up, the screen had gone dark. The boy hadn't said a word. He'd slipped out the second he realized there was nothing left to gain. No fight, no goodbye, just silence. That told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties had always been. David cleared his throat softly, gathering the last of his papers. His voice was calm but final. "The court will be notified immediately. Margaret's will is ironclad. Elijah's status as heir is secure. As of today, Henry, you maintain controlling shares until transition, and Elijah is recognized as successor." Brooke's absence left a vacuum in the room, one filled not with tension, but with exhaustion. Mitchell finally stood, the letter still in his hand. His face was pale, streaked with tears. He tried to speak, his lips moving without sound. Finally, a single word came out, choked and raw. "Why?" I didn't have an answer. Not one that would make sense to him. All I could say was the truth. "Your mother loved you, Mitchell. That's never been in question." His shoulders heaved. He nodded once, shaky, then shuffled out of the room, still clutching the pages. He didn't look back. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd ever known in this building. It wasn't the silence of tension, or grief, or even fear. It was the silence of something ending, and something else beginning. David packed up his briefcase. He paused at the door, giving me a steady look. "She'd be proud, Henry," he said. "And she'd tell you the same thing I will. Take care of yourself. This isn't over, but the worst of it is behind you." When he left, only Elijah and I remained. He stood across the table, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his eyes wide with everything he'd just witnessed. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "This company, this inheritance, it feels bigger than me." I walked to the window, looking out over the Dallas skyline. Cranes dotted the horizon, steel beams rising into the morning sun. "Legacy always feels bigger than any one person," I said. "But you've been carrying it longer than you realize. I've seen it in how you lead men, how you solve problems. This isn't about blood alone. It's about heart." Elijah came to stand beside me. His reflection in the glass looked steady, even if his breath wasn't. He nodded, slowly, as if testing the weight of the word, air. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deep and steady. The war was over, but the ripples had only begun. And just when I thought it was settled, 3 days passed before the phone rang with a new kind of trouble. I was in my study, Margaret's cedar box still on the desk, when David's number lit up my cell. "Henry," he said, his voice tight, "we've got a wrinkle." I stiffened. "Brooke again?" "No," he said. "Ryan." I sank back into my chair. That boy had vanished from the boardroom without a word, like a ghost slipping through a wall. "What about him?" David sighed. "He's filed a petition in probate court. Claims the DNA evidence is inconclusive and that the will's direct bloodline clause discriminates against adopted heirs." My gut twisted. It was exactly the kind of stunt Brooke would have pulled, weaponizing legal language to stir doubt. She must have coached him before she was shown the door. What are the chances? I asked. David was quiet for a beat. Slim, but not zero. Judges don't like gray areas in family law. He's not arguing for Mitchell. He's arguing for himself, as a grandson, entitled by bloodline through Mitchell, regardless of what the DNA says about paternity. I clenched the phone tighter. Ryan, who had spent more time chasing parties than paychecks, suddenly saw himself as the savior of the Callahan name? No, this wasn't about legacy. This was about cash. But the twist hit deeper than anger. If the court gave Ryan standing, it would drag Elijah into a fight he hadn't asked for. The boy had just learned he had a father. Now he might be forced to defend that truth in public, in headlines, in courtrooms. That night, I found Elijah at the Oak Cliff site. He was walking the rows of half-framed houses, clipboard in hand, the setting sun painting everything in orange. Did you, hey? I asked. He nodded. David called me too. Ryan's going to fight. There was no fear in his voice, only frustration. I don't want this to be a circus, he said. I didn't ask for any of it. I just wanted to build. I put a hand on his shoulder. Legacy doesn't wait for clean timing, son. Sometimes it tests you before you're ready. He met my eyes. Steady now. Then we fight clean. No mud, no theatrics. Just the truth. The next week, we sat in probate court. Ryan showed up with a sharp-suited lawyer who spoke in lofty tones about the evolving definition of family. Ryan himself wore a too expensive watch, his eyes darting nervously toward the reporters scribbling in the gallery. David stood, calm as ever. He didn't waste time on speeches. He simply laid down Margaret's letter, the DNA report, and the minutes of board meetings showing Brooke and Mitchell's schemes. Then he called Elijah to the stand. My son, my real son, walked forward with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to hide. He spoke about his adoption, his upbringing, his years working in the company without ever asking for more than a paycheck. He didn't grandstand. He didn't posture. He just told the truth. And for the first time, I saw the judge lean forward, listening not as a lawyer but as a human being. When it was over, the ruling was swift. The will is unambiguous. The DNA evidence is clear. Mr. Ryan Callahan lacked standing. Petition denied. Ryan's face crumpled. He didn't rage like Brooke. He didn't collapse like Mitchell. He just looked empty. The fight had been his last play, and it was gone. He slipped out of the courtroom the same way he'd left the boardroom, quiet, unseen, irrelevant. As Elijah stepped down from the stand, I felt a swell of something I hadn't felt in months. Not just victory, not just relief. Something larger. Pride. The storm had tested us one last time, and Elijah had proven not only his bloodline, but his spirit. What I learned wasn't about them. It was about me. When the courthouse emptied, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor. The last few weeks had stripped me bare of illusions, of comfortable lies, even of the son I thought was mine. And yet, standing there with Elijah, I realized I hadn't lost everything. I had found something true. For years, I believed keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries. Margaret would warn me with just a glance, "Don't let them push you, Henry." And I would nod, then let Mitchell and Brooke have their way on small things, thinking it wasn't worth the fight. But those small surrenders became habits, and those habits opened doors for greed to walk right in. I thought love alone could protect a legacy. I was wrong. Love without boundaries is like concrete without rebar, smooth on the surface, but it crumbles when pressure hits. Margaret knew better. She had carried her terrible secret for 48 years not because she didn't trust me, but because she thought it was the only way to hold us together. In the end, it wasn't her silence that saved me. It was her courage to finally write the truth, even if it broke everything else. What I learned is this: legacy isn't about blood, or names carved into office doors. It's about the work you build, the values you stand on, the boundaries you refuse to let others cross. Mitchell bore my name, but Elijah carried my heart. And in the end, that mattered more. I also learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. Forgiving Margaret doesn't erase the pain, but it honors the love that made her risk everything. Forgiving myself means admitting I let greed circle my family for too long, and promising never again. So here's what I want anyone listening to take away. Set boundaries early. Don't wait for someone to prove their greed before you draw your line. Protect what you've built, not out of fear, but out of respect, for yourself and for the people who will inherit it. Remember that a legacy is measured in integrity, not accounts or contracts. When people look back on your life, they won't remember how much you left them. They'll remember how much you stood for. And finally, don't confuse blood with loyalty. Sometimes, the truest family is the one who shows up when there's nothing to gain, when all that's left is the work and the values you hold dear. Margaret's letter broke my heart, but it also gave me clarity. I spent too long trying to keep the peace. Now I know peace without truth is just silence in disguise. Here's the picture I want you to keep. An old man and his son, not bound by decades of lies, but standing shoulder to shoulder, looking at the skyline they'll build together. That is legacy. The boardroom was quiet again, weeks after the storm. The mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights, but the air was different now. Not heavy with greed, not stifled by silence, but open, clean. I sat at the head of the table, Margaret's chair still empty beside me. For a moment, I let my hand rest on its leather arm, feeling the absence, the memory. Then I looked across the table, not at Brooke's glare, or Mitchell's slumped shoulders, or Ryan's absent seat. I looked at Elijah. He sat tall, not in arrogance but in steady confidence. His work shirt was still plain, but his posture carried something new. The men on site had already started calling him Mr. Hayes. But to me, he was more than a name. He was the future Margaret and I had built for, the living proof that integrity outlasts schemes. Together, we stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dallas stretched before us, steel skeletons rising against the morning sun. For the first time in months, I didn't see battlefields or unfinished wars. I saw foundations, strong, unshakable, waiting for the next generation to build higher. I thought of that first day, Brooke sliding her folder across this very table, her voice like ice. Sign it over, Henry. Back then, I had been grieving, broken, unsure if I had the strength to resist. But now, with Elijah beside me, I knew Margaret's wisdom had carried me through. The legacy wasn't stolen. It had been reforged. Legacy isn't written in ink or sealed with signatures. It's carved in choices, reinforced in truth, and passed not just through blood, but through heart. As I looked at the skyline, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, for Margaret, for her courage, for the lesson she left me, and for Elijah, the son I never knew I had, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.